We are going to be talking about today Anglicanism and the colonies, picking up where Dr. Rachel Toombs left off last week. I have a caveat to begin with. Out of all of our teachers in this series, many of them are about to receive PhDs or have PhDs already. Actually, I'm the only one that doesn't have one. And that's not to say that I know things. It means that I don't know things. I think Rachel asked me to do this to kind of take me down a few pegs, more than anything else. So just bear that in mind. Take it with a grain of salt. No, I'm really looking forward to getting to talk to you guys about this period of the church in the United States and in North America, and how it kind of relates in the things that come from this time that give us some of the things we do Sunday to Sunday, day to day in our daily prayer, and when we come to worship. We are doing some of these things that get talked about and get worked out at the beginning of the United States of America, and kind of this foundation. So, to begin, I would like to begin in prayer. I was trying to find, in the section of the Book of Common Prayer, there's some prayers and thanksgivings in the back, and on page 820 begin prayers for national life, which used to be, before the Episcopal Church, the Protestant Episcopal Church existed, would have been prayers for a king or a queen. And we'll get to talk a little bit about these changes today. But I'm going to have this prayer. It's for a local government. The Lord be with you. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send down upon those who hold office in this state, in this county, in this city, the spirit of wisdom, charity, and justice, and that with steadfast purpose they may faithfully serve in their offices to promote the well-being of all people through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Gives you a little bit of a flavor of some of the items that we'll be talking about today. But first, maybe you've seen motivational posters such as these. They're plastered all over our office here at the... No, they're not. They're really not. But Aaron's not here yet. If at first you don't succeed, try again. Have any of you heard this advice before? Yes. How did it go? Yeah. Maybe this works if you are trying to run a mile faster. Maybe this works in some ways if you are trying to lift weights and you really want that 1 rep maximum that's going to be perfect and great. But in general, I have found, and maybe you found this too, that this is horrible advice. Like, if you are doing something and you are not succeeding, get help. Stop trying to do it by yourself. Phone a friend. And I'm speaking to myself. I don't know about you, but I generally have trouble asking people for help for any sort of things. But do not do this advice. Realize you're a wretched sinner in need of God's grace and call someone up. But this quote is the vibe that the early church in the colonies has. When we don't get it right, when we're trying to figure it out, when they're building the ship, as the ship is sailing, this ship of Anglicanism in the colonies. Thank you. That is, that's kind of the vibe they have is, okay, we're not going to get this right, or we don't get it right. They realize it after the fact, and then they keep trying again and again. And when we're looking at the development of Anglicanism in the colonies, and when we look at it in America, in what is the 13 colonies, one thing I want us to kind of have in mind as we have this discussion. Anglicanism was never meant to leave England. It is the Church of England. It is something that is distinct to the British Isles. They exported a lot of things then, and Anglicanism should not have been one of them. And it was hard for people to, well, it's great we're here now, but it was never meant to leave England. And we live in a world in kind of this global communion where that kind of phrase might seem odd. It might seem odd that Anglicanism was very particular, and still kind of is very particular, to a certain group of people, to a certain geographic location, And it has a particular understanding of what the relationship is between the church and between the state. Our other presenters and teachers have talked about this. But to be Anglican for so many years was to be English, was to live in England, was to live, die, and work and have your family, your culture as English, unless you willfully dissented. And then they sent you here. If you willfully dissented, well, you could stay in England, and sometimes they'd kill you. Sometimes they would not. Sometimes they would ostracize you. But they would also send you to these places, to the 13 colonies. I love a good map, I just want to say. And this map is really great. I just think it's a nice little map. And a couple things I kind of want to point out as we start talking. So the religion that gets picked up in the colonies, the types of Christianities that you generally find, are pretty distinct. And I'm talking mostly in the 17th century. So like when people start arriving in the early 1600s to the end and into the 18th century, colonial religion was very dependent on where you lived and the context of where you lived, whether you were in Georgia or whether you were in Rhode Island or New York or Pennsylvania, or Virginia, depending on where you lived in any of these places. Your sense of what normal people did when they went to church would differ wildly. First and foremost, the colonies were formed, it was kind of like the internet of the 17th century. It was this new thing. It was a new frontier for business, for education, for trade, and lots of things. Lots of money-making opportunities were available for people that could get a charter to come and live in the colonies and make money and send those things back to England. So trading companies are our first charters that end up in the colonies. Virginia started this way with Jamestown. Charters can be given to other people as well. We have charters that are given to special interest groups, these people that willfully dissent, these separatists that start the Plymouth colony. We talked a little bit with Dr. Rachel Toombs about the Puritans at the end of her talk. The Puritans start the Massachusetts Bay colony. And there are also royal charters given to the nobility. You think about places like Pennsylvania or Maryland. Those are given as grants to certain people. Lord Baltimore in Maryland and to William Penn in Pennsylvania. And both of these had religious aspects as well, at least initially. Pennsylvania and its relationship to the Quakers, and William Penn's relationship to the Quakers. And in Maryland, Maryland, a lot of Catholics lived there. Lord Baltimore has this, he's this English noble, and it's funny, in some sources it's talked about as kind of this coming out of being a Catholic. Like it was this scandal at the time when he does this. Georgia started as a debtor colony through a grant to James Oglethorpe, who we talked about at the very end of last class. You could also get a charter through conquest. New York, taken from the Dutch. Canada, conquered from the French. All of these things you could get a charter to live and to work and to have people come and fill these places. But what does it mean for us when we're talking about Anglicanism? Because I'm talking a lot about denominations that are not the Episcopal Church, that are not the Church of England. Well, depending on how your colony was founded and its relationship to the British government largely determined where you would worship and who, probably if you even went. And it was not assumed, it was expected that if the Church of England was in charge, the national church, or the church in which everything kind of went through, was going to be the Church of England. So even though in all of these places there are certain religious flavors, certain denominational flavors, the Church of England is still something that's going to be front and center in many of these. It might be small at some times, but the people that are in power often are members of the Church of England. I just want to look at these two folks for a minute. We've got one. He looks like he's ready to sell me some oatmeal. That's William Penn. And then on the right, Lord Baltimore or Dracula. I'm not sure. It's Lord Baltimore. Um, these two are examples of the royal charters. This is Lord Baltimore before he was on The Wire, obviously. Um, but yeah, these are the kind of folks that you might think of when you think of the Quakers. This is like the Quaker of Quakers. I just really think he's great. And I really wanted to share that photo with you. So this region that we have on these maps, we have New England colonies, the middle colonies, the mid-Atlantic colonies, and then we have the southern colonies. When we talk about Anglicanism in the colonies, it's better to say Anglicanisms, multiple forms of kind of how Anglicanism is getting worked out, multiple forms of how people are doing church on a day-to-day basis, multiple forms of, if you've got a clergy a priest who lives in Virginia, maybe in Savannah, they are going to be thinking very different things probably about the role of bishops, about maybe some aspects of communion. They're going to be thinking very different things politically as well during this time. So I'll tell you about kind of each one in succession. So in New England, except for Rhode Island, all of New England is primarily congregational churches, meaning these churches don't have a body that is kind of a big body that oversees them. Each of their individual churches has polity, and they have their own polity. They don't need to talk to anyone above them. They are doing church where they are doing church. Bob's church is doing Bob's church in Boston. Darren's church is doing Darren's church in somewhere else in New England. I don't care about there. I live in Texas. Hartford, I don't know. And so as these colonies are getting going, Anglicanism is viewed with suspicion, especially in New England. By the 18th century, the colonies had kind of been consolidated mostly, and Connecticut is a good example, and Massachusetts is a good example of the ones that were under royal charters. Rhode Island had a decent bit of religious diversity. There were some early Jewish communities that existed in Rhode Island, and this is of interest to everyone, I'm sure. The first Baptist church in the United States was set up in, well, it was the colonies then, but in Rhode Island, so mark that one off on your list. In New England, Anglicanism arrived at the end of the 17th century, typically with the cultural elite, with governors, with civil servants, with merchants, and they set up their houses of worship, they set up their chapels, and King's Chapel is a good example of one of these places in Boston. It is the first Anglican church in Boston in 1686. And interesting enough, it eventually becomes a Unitarian church and has an interesting trajectory. In the mid-Atlantic states, in those green states, Anglicanism benefits through the established law in these charters and in these colonies. So Anglicanism in most of the mid-Atlantic states is written into their charters, is written into how they operate, how much land is given to the Church of England. Trinity Wall Street, if you've been to Manhattan, sits on Wall Street, and it's one of the oldest churches in Manhattan. It still is there today. And this was a land grant given to Trinity. Think of how very expensive things in Manhattan are. But all of that land Trinity has sold and is one of the wealthiest churches it is the wealthiest church in North America, partially because they did have all of this land in Manhattan that they were able to sell off or rent. And they were granted this land. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, who we saw, had Anglicans that existed in Pennsylvania, but like I said, they were normally the cultural elite. Anglicanism was very strong in Philadelphia, which is a cosmopolitan center. We know it very well. If you've seen the movie, why am I blanking on Nicolas Cage's great film? Thank you, National Treasure, yes. Wow, we have some big Nick Cage fans. That's good. So only 2% of Philadelphia is Anglican at the time of the Revolution, but it has this oversized role because most of the most important people are Anglicans. Most of the most important people are a part of the English church, or part of the Anglican church. So in the southern states, Virginia is by far and away the most important. Anglicanism arrives in 1607 with the Jamestown colony, and with the formation of what the Virginia legislature, the House of Burgesses had, the state government takes over the role that Parliament plays for the English church. The House of Burgesses in Virginia takes that over for the English church in Virginia. Technically, and this is interesting, the rectors that would serve at congregations, so people like Aaron, so the head priest, the head pastor that would serve at a church, had to be picked out by the House of Burgesses. But they give that role to the individual churches, which gives you a flavor of these people are known as kind of low church folks, and we'll talk about high church in a moment. It has nothing to do with the growing of hemp in Virginia, but high church is different. Low church folks generally did not think highly of bishops, generally were not interested in polity, church polity, the ways in which we talk to each other about theological debates and figure things out. They were not interested in kind of the way that the Church of England had established themselves in the past, but we're looking kind of for different ways. They were very influenced by the congregational churches that existed at this time. In all of these places, the Anglican Church was supported by taxation in a way that we do not do that today. Yeah. And we kind of get this, Rachel had this gift last week of a tug of war with some dogs, and I wanted to find another one. And so these are kind of the three, thank you, Rachel. This was just for Rachel. This is from a puppy bowl. These are kind of the three strands of Anglicanism that are battling during the 17th and early 18th century in the colonies. We've got the middle colonies, the New England colonies, and the southern colonies. They're not necessarily interacting a ton other than getting people from England, getting priests from England, getting, in some, well, not any bishops, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So if you were at a church, how would you get a priest? How would you get, you come to this new town, you build the church, and then you wait for a priest to be assigned. Now, many of these colonies, many of these churches were kind of under the jurisdiction of a diocese that existed in England. So maybe a diocese that's in London has control over who you're getting as your priest in Maryland, or who you're getting as your priest in Pennsylvania, which can be a little complicated. Not only the fact that people die trying to get from England to the colonies. By some accounts, 15% of all people that try to make that trip end up dying on the way. And it creates this tension where people are wanting their own bishops. We're wanting our own diocese. We're wanting our own control over how church is being run. We're wanting our own, we want to have more connection. The bishop comes and visits. We get a bishop visit twice a year here. Some of those churches would have never seen any type of bishop. What they might have seen was somebody picked by a bishop, like to say, Andrew, you will be the person to show up and act as a bishop. You can't ordain anyone, so you can't put hands on anyone. You can't do some of the liturgical and political things that a bishop would do, but you can show up and you can do the administrative work of the bishop, which is super boring. Why would you want that job? That's like the worst part of the job. Yeah. A few other things that show up at this time in Anglicanism prior to the Revolutionary War. The vestry system. We have a vestry. We benefit from this system. The vestry system functioned in England for a long, long time. And it was the ways in which the lay people looked after the church's property, the social programs, distributing money to the parishes, which is an actual line, like a boundary that the parish has. And if you live within that boundary, and if you're very poor, likely some alms would be given to you. They would, ideally, ideally, things would be taken care of for you. And so the vestries, as they come into the United States, as they come into the colonies, though, do not kind of take the same route as vestries in England. In Virginia, the state legislature writes in the vestries as a part of each individual parish. But in Virginia, the vestries have the right to choose and appoint clergy. And in other colonies, vestries generally become the group that gets in charge of calling a rector. So in the case of the Church of England at this time, someone would be appointed and dropped down. But in the colonies, they call rectors. They call priests to come and work for them, which is how it works for us right now. The missionary societies that exist at this time, because there are many folks, look at these names. These are just mouthfuls of names. The Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. Wow. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. These are missionary societies that are basically funding the salaries and what churches can do in the colonies at this time. They're not getting a ton of money from some bishop's lands. They are not getting a lot of money at all from the Church of England as a whole. And so these missionary societies pop up and they pass out books. They pass out educational material. They pass out Bibles. They set up schools for Native Americans and enslaved folks. They contribute significantly to the spread of Anglicanism in what was previously a very congregationalist, a very congregationalist area. The SPG supported 300 of these missionaries, and over half of them were in New England. So there's not a ton of Anglicans in New England, but the SPG is basically forcing Anglicanism to kind of stay alive in a place where it probably wouldn't have if these missionary societies didn't exist. By some accounts, it's a miracle that the Anglican Church or the Episcopal Church even survived this time, let alone the post-Revolutionary War time. Something that happened in pre-Revolutionary War Anglicanism was the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening, the first one in the 1740s, establishes this pattern of revival and renewal. And a lot of the language that we get in contemporary evangelicalism in the United States begins. Some of that verbiage enters into the bloodstream of Christianity in America. Revival, renewal, personal conversion, all of these things are a departure from traditional Anglican understandings of a rational religion, of a rational understanding of faith and structured liturgy. There are tent revivals, and it leads to a massive growth of churches, a massive growth of Presbyterians, of Baptists, of other Congregationalists. And it's the first time, the Great Awakening is one of the first times in the colonies in which Christianity actually engages with enslaved peoples. So, by and large, the Anglican Church was not supportive of the Great Awakening. Post-Restoration Anglicanism, after the 1662 prayer book, tended not to blend super well with some of these Great Awakening ideals. It had an emphasis on rationality instead of enthusiasm. They have a prayer book. They don't have extemporaneous prayers. Many of these preachers that would get up during the Great Awakening would have these long extemporaneous prayers and preaching services at these revival meetings that went on for a very long time. There was a deep-seated notion that any type of enthusiasm of the masses would lead to anarchy. We need the structured prayer book. We need order. That's what we need. And none of these in people that really loved the Anglican Church, they didn't see any of these things in some of these Great Awakening moments. But the Great Awakening did affect Anglicanism with the rise of Methodism. Methodism, before it kind of became its own thing, was a part of the Anglican Church, was a part of the Church of England. We'll talk about that in a moment, but Methodism has this emphasis on preaching, had this emphasis at the time on reading the Bible in a particular way, had a particular emphasis on the sacraments, on what clergy can do, on all of those things. And it crosses, this movement crosses denominational lines, so it affects Presbyterians, it affects Anglicans, it affects absolutely everyone. Slavery also is something that is identified with pre- and post-Revolutionary War Anglicanism. And I'll just say a few things about that here. I would like to point out there, on occasion, is a class offered that talks about kind of the Episcopal Church's relationship to slavery historically that Andrew and Rachel were able to teach. Can you remind me the name of that class? Thank you. Sacred Ground. Is it Sacred Ground? Thank you. We just finished up that class in the fall, and it's a very long course. It can do more justice to this subject than I can do right now, but I just want to kind of give you just an image into this. The Virginia House of Burgesses in 1667 ruled that they ruled that baptism did not change the status of an indentured servant or a slave. So if you had a slave got baptized, what are you going to do? Because this person, who apparently is not a person, is now getting a sacrament that is given to people. And so the Virginia House of Burgesses rules that no, baptism doesn't change the status of an indentured servant or slave, that they can't be freed based on their baptism. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel has this clause in the baptismal covenant in which enslaved persons had to explicitly declare that they were not seeking baptism for the good of their souls and not out of a desire for freedom, which is really dark. It's a very dark time. The last thing that we'll talk about here is the lack of bishops. There is a bishop problem. The people in the colonies are like this man, Jesus. I see what you've given to the Church of England with these bishops, and I just want the same. The issue, I know it doesn't make a ton of sense to us initially about why bishops were not around in the colonies where we're sitting. But if a bishop, number one, the Bishop of Cambridge, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Archbishop of York, these are bishops that have had traditional seats since the 600s, since sometimes even earlier. These are long-standing institutions. And so in some ways, they were kind of like, well, we don't know how to create a new one because we haven't done that in a very, very long time. And the issue of not having a bishop comes in when you need more clergy. These churches are getting planted. These places are being inhabited, and they're running out of clergy. Any priest that you want has to come all the way over from England. Many of them die in the process, and then they arrive, and then they get sick, and then they die. And so there's this clergy shortage. I mean, there's one now, but it was really bad then. And here's part of the issue. If you look at that picture on the left, you see the guys in the hats? Those are the bishops, in case you were wondering. These bishops, you need generally 3 bishops to make another bishop. This goes back to ancient Christian documents from the 4th century that get attested to kind of time and time again. Some of them say 3, some of them say 2. All of them say many bishops are needed to make a new bishop. And even in our own constitution, we have a constitution in the Episcopal Church, it says that no one shall be ordained and consecrated bishop by fewer than 3 bishops. And so in the colonies, this question of a bishop was a hotly debated issue because the bishop not only represented the ecclesiastical kind of authority, this spiritual head, but it also represented England. Bishops hold seats in the House of Lords. Bishops function in ways as judges, as they have these civil responsibilities, that people in the colonies are, these largely Congregationalist colonies, are really not, that's not the vibe we're going for here. We kind of don't want these bishops. But the established church, the Church of England, the Anglicans, are really needing them in order to grow, are really needing them in order to attend to the things that they have. So there were issues between the bishop and the state, and there were also issues on how to pay these bishops. Is this money going to come from other regions in England, and we're just going to pay them that way? Who's going to pay for these bishops? So I mentioned earlier, sometimes bishops would elect someone to serve in their role. It was a commissary was the name of this. And so this commissary would go and do the administrative functions, but not really the liturgical functions. Everyone that supported bishops were primarily Anglicans, and everyone that did not support the creation of bishops were primarily non-Anglicans. There were some Anglicans in the southern states generally that did not as much want bishops as much as the Anglicans in the northern colonies. At this point, I want to have a very short kind of excursus because I haven't talked about Methodism, and I want to. John Wesley on the left, Charles Wesley in the middle, and George Whitefield were all folks. Look at these, again, the photos. Whitefield, yeah. Portraits, thank you. Oh, they're, well, yeah, fair. Look at these guys. Yeah. Oh, yeah, stand up, thank you. He's wearing his preaching tabs, which I'm not preaching today, so I'm not wearing them, and I generally don't. But this was a common thing to wear. It's kind of like the precursor, even this little guy is like a precursor to a necktie, is a precursor to maybe you have an actual collar on. They used to have to be pinned on and that kind of thing. But all of these Methodists were and died as Anglican clergymen. They all were a part of the Church of England. Methodism it came out of this desire to bring the church to people that were not coming to church or were not inside the church. So John and Charles Wesley get popular in England for riding around on horseback, holding preaching services in fields, holding preaching. Have you seen the show like Peaky Blinders, that street they live on that's all brick and it's nasty and it's gross and people have soot? They are holding church services outside in these dirty, nasty places with those dirty, nasty people. Can you imagine? Oh, they get popular doing this. They get popular with the people that don't normally come to church doing this. And there is a sense in which these men, part of the reason why they're doing these things is this pursuit of holiness in their life. They say that faith should produce an inward and outward holiness in the things that you're doing. And Methodism, I don't have time to do it all justice, and I'm sure that I have Methodist friends that will watch this and just berate me in my text messages after. But Methodism becomes popular in the colonies with the First Great Awakening. And George Whitefield, who you see on the far right, is this Anglican clergyman who he never takes a post in England. He is an itinerant preacher, so he goes from tent to tent, place to place, and preaches. And it is said that this man could say the word Mesopotamia and bring people to tears. He would, right? Can you imagine? Come on, Aaron. Mesopotamia. He comes to the colonies, and he is really what brings that First Great Awakening that we talked about. Good preaching, personal renewal of faith, a lot of the foundations for American evangelicalism and what we have today. He has what is called a lazy eye in one of his eyes, and you can kind of see it in this portrait, but in some other portraits you can see it even better. And it had this effect that he could look at everyone at the same time. I'm not kidding. People write about this, and they have this experience of listening to him preach, and they're like, he was looking right at me. How is he doing this? Only by the Spirit could this man... No. I'm not making this up. It's wild. So, that's Methodism. We'll get there in a moment. The next slide, though, has a clip of one of my favorite people in the Anglican Church who is popular in a recent Broadway hit. If you know the name Samuel Seabury, he's the one in this next video with the preaching tabs on. And we'll play part of his song from that musical. All right. Yes. Clap it up for Samuel Seabury. Samuel Seabury, what we saw right there was at the American Revolution, we are running into issues in the liturgy. We are running into issues where some priests are loyal to the Continental Congress. Some priests are loyal, many of them are loyal to the king. And this prayer comes from the Book of Common Prayer, 1662. And this was a super contentious prayer that would have been said at morning prayer. When people would gather on Sundays, morning prayer was typically the office that was used. And this prayer had to be said for the king's majesty. And while the war is going on, there are Anglican clergy who are writing to England asking, can I say this prayer? Can I say a prayer for the Continental Congress? Which ruler can I pray for? Which is why we did one of these early on. And people get killed for praying this prayer in some cases. People are dragged out by mobs. We have, we most heartily and beseech thee with thy favor to behold the most gracious sovereign Lord, King George. That's where Samuel Seabury is coming from in that video. You can probably see why during a time of revolution that prayer would be complicated. So he is, look at those sleeves. That is his mitre that they still have up in Connecticut. So he's a loyalist. He's a high church. He's imprisoned for a short time. He eventually is able to become a bishop. And I want to, before we continue, I want these prayers as well to be said. So when they would come together for communion, they would ask to defend all Christian kings, princes, and governors, especially George our king. And then at the bottom, you see it says bishops and curates. Wow, curates. Look at that. After the war, what did it mean to be an Anglican after the war? You still don't have any bishops. No one in England was sending them bishops, and you need 3. And what happens is Samuel Seabury, who's a part of that northern colonies kind of contingent, heads over to the people that hate England even more than the people in the Americas. Not the Irish, the Scottish. Yeah. And so he goes up there and he asks, well, first he technically goes to England and he says, please, will you make me a bishop? We really need some bishops. Things are horrible right now. And this is in the 1780s, like in the 83, 84-ish, when he's trying to ask for help. And he gets no help from England, but these Scottish bishops lay their hand upon him. This is an image that is in many Episcopal churches. They lay their hands on him, they pray over him, they ordain him as a bishop, and he comes back. And at this time, the Anglican Church, post-war, is trying to figure out how to be a church in the Americas, is trying to figure out, they write a constitution, like any good new thing, that institution that's happening at this time. They write these canons, these laws. People write all of these different tracts about why we should be an Episcopal Church. Names are thrown around on what to call themselves. We can't call ourselves the Church of England. One of them is the Reformed Catholic Church. I like that one, but it didn't get there. So the Protestant Episcopal Church, Protestant, because Episcopal means that we have bishops, and we have bishops that we adhere to, that matter for us. But Catholics also have bishops, Eastern Orthodox also have, so we got to say Protestant Episcopal Church. And what kind of comes out of the first general conventions in the 1780s, the northern colonies don't even show up initially because they're not interested. They've got their own bishop. We've got Samuel Seabury. Why do we need any of you? And what it turns into is these three parties, the Mid-Atlantic, the New England, and the Methodists, who are fighting over what the Episcopal Church, the Protestant Episcopal Church, is going to look like. The Methodists are being dragged because they never really were in it anyway. They kind of weren't interested to begin with. But the Mid-Atlantic folks and the New England folks, theologically and church polity-wise, are the people that come together to create what a lot of the structures that we now have in the Episcopal Church, which I have more notes on if I wouldn't have spent so much time on other things when I was teaching. Rachel's nodding. She's like, you're flying through. Okay. But they work together and they compromise. And that idea of the via media, where people are coming together to try to create something new and try to do it in a way that both honors their firm theological convictions, but also the convictions that they're coming together as a communion to have, is shown in the creation of the Protestant Episcopal Church. The Book of Common Prayer gets changed from the 1662 version because we can't have prayers about the king. We can't have prayers about the king in England. We can't have any of that. The term minister is substituted for priest in some cases, and in all of these prayer book revisions, the last one is approved in 1789, and that is where I'm going to have to leave it today.